Ethics and integrity in the workplace. When I first sat down and started working on this presentation, I thought about what's a good definition of integrity. And C.S. Lewis said that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one else is watching. So what does integrity in the workplace mean for all of us as city employees? Well, as city employees, we're governed by all sorts of rules. There's the personnel rules and regulations, there are city ordinances, there are administrative instructions, but at the end of the day, as they relate to our conduct, they all say that we need to do the right thing even when no one else is watching, so that we need to be people of integrity when we're at work. City's personnel rules and regulations govern all sorts of things, all the way from the city operator permit, the COP, to employee benefits, to Section 300, which is the conditions of employment. A lot of the rules that relate to ethics in the workplace and integrity live in Section 301, the Code of Conduct in the personnel rules and regulations. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about some of these rules and regs. And the ones that just came up on the screen are the ones that I'm going to go over with all of you today. So the first rules we'll take are Section 301.1, duty to the public, and Section 301.2, professional excellence. And after that, we're going to talk about 301.3, which are the standards of conduct. And when we're talking about how these rules apply to employees, it's sort of useful to take them as a group because in a way they're all fairly similar. So Section 301.1, duty to the public, says that an employee's first duty is to be a public servant, and that everything that we do as city employees should be guided by the principle that we are public servants and that our job, first and foremost, is to be there for the citizens of Albuquerque. Within that, employees are instructed that they need to follow state, local, and federal law. As to 301.2, professional excellence, as you might expect with a name like professional excellence, that rule says that we as employees need to basically just be professionals while we're at work, and that is regardless of what your specific job is. If you're an assistant city attorney, be a professional. If you're a city bus driver, be a professional. So some examples of what it would be to not be following Section 301.1 and 301.2 would be things like endangering the public while you're at work, or being rude and nasty to the public while you're at work. But the flip side of those rules, a person who is upholding Section 301.1, duty to the public, or 301.2, professionalism, is someone who, when they're dealing with the public, answers questions promptly and in a courteous manner that treats people fairly. Section 301.3, standards of conduct, has 4 subparts. The first subpart says, again, that employees need to behave in a professional manner, and that in behaving in a professional manner, they need to behave in a way that promotes trust and confidence in the city. The second part says that employees mustn't engage in offensive behavior, and offensive behavior includes jokes, offensive language, offensive materials at work, so any kind of derogatory behavior, racist comments, sexist comments, things of that nature. The third subsection of 301.3 addresses having dangerous things at work. Employees should not have drugs, alcohol, weapons, explosives, things of that nature while they're at work. The fourth subpart directs us as employees to notify our supervisors if we have a criminal conviction or enter a no contest plea in any sort of manner or any sort of issue that relates to our job with the city. And as employees, I should note, it's best for us just to err on the side of caution. And if something happens to us while we're outside of work, if we have a run-in with the law, it's best to err on the side of caution and to notify a supervisor. As I said, with each of these rules, we're going to talk about what they mean for employees. And taking 301.1, 301.2, and 301.3 together, what do they mean for us as employees? They mean a lot of different things. And they mean different things depending on the context in which the rule comes up. But some pretty big examples and things that we can all try and keep in mind. All of these rules have a lot to do with city property, for one. City property should only be used for city purposes. It shouldn't be used for personal gain, or it shouldn't be misused when being used on behalf of the city. Another example are city funds. If you as an employee are someone who handles cash for the city, or you process payments, or you pay vendors on behalf of the city of Albuquerque, you have to follow any and all cash handling, any and all accounting procedures, because that's how you act as a professional while you're at work. Another thing that falls under these rules are the idea that while you're at work on behalf of the city, you should only be doing city business as a city employee. An example here is, say someone runs some sort of a charity on their off time, and while they're at work on behalf of the city, they're on their city computer, and every now and then they send some emails on behalf of that charity they run on the side. Well, your first thought might be, gee, that's a wonderful thing that someone's doing, how benevolent, how wonderful. But the fact of the matter is that that's doing something that's not city business while on city time. So that act would violate likely all three of these rules, 3011, 3012, 3013. Another central idea behind these three rules is that as employees, we need to treat others the way that we'd like to be treated, that golden rule that we've all been taught since childhood. And that means not only members of the public, but it means our co-workers as well. Another way to think of this, and especially when we're thinking about that third part of 3013 under standards of conduct, is that not everyone has the same sense of humor. And what might be a clever or funny joke to one person could be derogatory and offensive to the other. So it's just best for us as employees to keep in mind that what I think is funny, the next person might not. And I should just err on the side of caution when I'm at work. Another important point here for employees is that we really need to not confuse our personal lives with our professional lives. We all have personal lives, things that are going on at home, but that when we come to work, it's our duty to behave as professionals and to not let our personal lives interfere with how well we perform our work. And this goes for any interpersonal relationships that we might have with our coworkers, as well as the relationships we have with others outside of the city. The bottom line, when we're all thinking about these rules, is that it's best to just, before we take any kind of course of action, before you say anything, before you do anything, to stop and think before you act. And if you have a question or concern about whether or not something that you're doing or about to do violates any of these rules, you really should ask. The next rule we're going to talk about is 3014, and that deals with violence in the workplace. This rule says that violence is prohibited while we're at work for the city of Albuquerque, and that this includes things like physical assaults, verbal assaults, the possession of weapons, even jokes that are reasonably perceived to be a threat of immediate harm or danger to another could fall under this rule of violence in the workplace. So what does this mean for all of us as employees of the city of Albuquerque? Well, the most important point is that it means more than just the obvious being that we shouldn't hurt one another when we're at work. Because violence in the workplace can also be construed as offensive words and offensive language. And again, city employees need to remember that it's incumbent upon them, it's a big part of their job while at work to make sure that members of the public feel safe and secure while they're on city premises, and also that all of us as employees, our coworkers, the people that we see day in and day out, feel safe and comfortable. So this rule about violence in the workplace is really about all of us working toward creating that environment where everyone feels safe and comfortable while they're at work. The next rule we're talking about is 3016, and that rule is report of abuse. This is the rule that tells us as city employees that it's our job to report things that we see going wrong at work. If people see abuse of equipment, facilities, programs, city privileges, and these are major and ongoing things, they need to report them. Another important part about this rule for all of us as employees to keep in mind is that a failure to report something going wrong, a failure to report abuse, can in itself be a basis for discipline within the city of Albuquerque. So as employees, it's our job to keep our eyes open, to be aware, and to go and report things if we need to. So what does this mean for us as employees? The biggest thing, if you see something going on that's wrong, you need to speak up. And this includes not just your coworkers, the people that work next to you all day, but it also includes supervisors. Anything that's going on needs to be reported. So the next logical question, I guess, then is how do I report? If employees see anything that constitutes abuse, abuse of privileges, abuse of city properties, property misuse, things of that nature, you all need to go to your supervisor if that's the case. If that's not an option for you, you go to your supervisor's supervisor. There are lots of ways that abuse can be reported. There's the personnel officer for each department. There's also city's central HR. And I know the big concern here for everyone is probably, well, I don't want to be a tattletale. But when we're thinking about not wanting to be a tattletale, it's also useful to think about our obligations as city employees. The first one is, or one of the first ones, is to promote the safety and well-being of our coworkers and of the public, and also to protect and conserve city property. So when we think about those things as being sort of our principal purposes as city employees, then the need to report abuse becomes a lot clearer and maybe a lot easier. The next rule we'll talk about is 3018, and that has to do with safety at work. As you might expect, this is the rule that says that employees need to be safe at work, and that means using all appropriate and designated safety procedures, any safety equipment, and it also means that safety issues need to be reported. Beyond that, this rule also says that employees shouldn't engage in horseplay, any roughhousing, anything that would put anyone's safety at risk. All right, what does this mean for me as a city employee? Well, it means that the work that I do, the work that we all do as city employees, must be carried out in the safest possible manner. In the safest possible manner means using safety equipment, following safety procedures, like I said earlier. It also means that an employee who comes to work under the influence of drugs or alcohol is not doing their job in the safest manner possible. And again, as I said, this rule says for us as employees that if we see something unsafe, we need to report it. Because at the end of the day, a safe working environment is what's best for everyone. But again, that's also part of the idea behind safety. A safe working environment is also a professional working environment. 3019 deals with false statements and fraud. And this is the rule that says that an employee must not make false statements on any tests, in any investigations, in any investigatory interview, in any of the reports they make, their time cards, anything that they document. Honesty is key. This rule also says that we as employees can't knowingly withhold information about wrongdoing. And again, if you see something going on, if you see that a wrong has been committed, if you see any abuse of city property or privileges, they need to be reported. Looking in a little more detail at what this rule means for city employees. It means that honesty doesn't just count, that honesty is critical for all of us. It means that we need to be honest in making reports, in filling out our time cards, and filling out our P30s, in our timekeeping, in our requests for time off, anything and everything we do, it's important that we be honest. It also means that if you know of an inaccuracy or an error in any of those things that you have to report, that you should go and fix it in order to be telling the truth. The next rule we'll look at is 30110, which covers bribery, gifts, and donations. Now there's a lot of text associated with this rule, but it can be broken down fairly easily. And that's that employees shouldn't accept bribes, employees shouldn't try and make bribes, and employees shouldn't be doing any of those things in order to be transferred within the city, to be promoted within the city. This rule also says that employees shouldn't accept any kind of outside compensation or reward from someone outside of the city asking them to do their job or not to do their job. As employees, how does this rule affect us? What does it mean? It means that bribes are never okay. And as I mentioned before, it means that I can't offer anyone any money to be promoted within the city or to be transferred within the city. I can't take any money from someone outside the city if they're asking me to do my job or not to do my job. Just best not to even go near these sorts of things. One thing that may or may not come up for you as an employee within this rule is the idea of tips. I know where some of you work, you may or may not at times be offered tips by members of the public. It's not appropriate for city employees to be accepting tips. One suggestion for dealing with this, if it ever comes up for you as an employee, is to suggest that if someone's really pleased with city services, that maybe they make a donation or something. That money can still go toward a good cause, and that you appreciate the kudos, but you as a city employee cannot be accepting that outside money or gifts from people. But that's not to say that small occasional gifts that aren't worth a lot of money are a bad thing between city employees. We are allowed to give each other small gifts. All right, now we're going to go to 30112, which covers city property. And we're going to talk about city property for a while now. So this presentation is just going to get even more and more exciting. Oh, someone got my joke. Good. Okay. So 30112 tells us that it's our job to prevent the loss, misuse, the abuse, the theft of city property. And that you know, as city employees, depending on what our job is, you're entrusted with different kinds of city property. If you work for the biopark, you might be entrusted with the care of animals. And since they're city property, it's your job to make sure that they're well cared for. If you drive a city bus, it's your job to make sure that that piece of city property is well maintained, that it's not misused or damaged. This rule also says that city employees mustn't use city property for their own individual personal gain or profit. I can't take this city computer that I borrowed to do this presentation and go out and run a business on the side for my own personal gain with the city computer. I have to use it for a city purpose and on city time. All right, for city employees, the rule that deals with city property means more than just city property that's in regular use. It also covers city property that may not seem like it has much value, or property that's broken or that's extra. Even if it's something that may seem worthless to an employee, it's still city property, and it needs to be treated as such. And as I said earlier, this rule says that city property can only be used for city business. So there are some things that are like maybe some obvious don'ts in this rule that city property can only be used for city business. Don't steal city fuel. That's an obvious don't within this. But some other things that might not seem so obvious right away when you read the rule are things, as I mentioned earlier, regarding property that's not in use. If I see that there are some extra staplers in the supply room in my office, and man, no one's used those staplers for months, they've just been sitting there collecting dust, that doesn't mean that they're not city property and that I can just take them. They still belong to the city of Albuquerque. I know it's silly, the staplers, but it's what comes to mind here. They're not up for grabs. We're going to leave the world of personnel rules and regulations now and talk about some city ordinances. And surprise, surprise, the ordinances that we're going to talk about have to do with property. The two that we're going to talk about are 5516 and 542. And 5516 talks about what is surplus, scrap, and salvage property and how those different types of property are disposed of. And 542 talks about property that's been left with the city. So basically lost and found type property. 5516. And again, this is another one of those rules that's got a lot of text, a lot of words in here. So just to sort of break down how the city looks at these different types of property, salvage property is city property of any value that's no longer working but that has some sort of value on the market. Surplus property is property of any value that still works, but that isn't needed by the department that you're working in or any other department within the city. Scrap property is surplus property that doesn't have any value on the market, so that can't be salvaged property, or it's property for which the cost that it would take to fix it or to maintain it is outweighed by the value of it. An unclaimed property, the last one there at the end, is property that doesn't belong to the city. It's, like I said earlier, it's lost and found property, anything that's been left with the city for an owner to come back and reclaim. What do all of these definitions mean for me as a city employee? Luckily for me, as a regular city employee, I don't really need to worry so much about them, because the person who determines what's scrap, what's salvage, what's surplus property isn't the regular employee. It's the department through their property disposal officer. So if you as an employee have any questions or concerns, if you have property lying around or that you think might fall in one of these categories and that could be disposed of, it's not on you as the individual employee to make the decision what to do with it. The important thing to remember is that you should go to your supervisor, or again to your supervisor's supervisor, and your department will work with their property disposal officer to determine how this property should be dealt with. Unclaimed personal property, the lost and found property. Any unclaimed personal property, lost and found property, needs to be recorded. And the city should try and return the unclaimed personal property to the true owner. Now, here's the biggest thing for lost and found property. For us as city employees, just because it's in the lost and found doesn't mean it's up for grabs. The city, again, needs to try and return that property, and it needs to be recorded in case someone does come back and try and take it or take back possession of it. Surplus property, scrap property, salvage property, they're all disposed of in different ways. And again, the good news for most of us as city employees is that we don't need to worry about that because someone else makes those decisions. The common thing about these rules on property is that just because something is old, unused, it's collecting dust, doesn't mean that it's up for grabs. Again, there are certain processes that need to be followed for that property to be disposed of. The idea is that city property should have its use maxed out for city purposes by other city departments before the city even lets go of it. An important point here for employees to remember is that if your job requires that you work with property that's going to be salvaged or disposed of in the salvage or surplus process, that you shouldn't manipulate the salvage or surplus process and the disposal of that property for your own gain. That as employees, again, we have to be people of integrity and to be professionals. All right, administrative instructions. We're going to talk about one administrative instruction, and surprise, surprise, it has to do with city property. This administrative instruction tells us that our use of city property should be in a way that benefits the people of Albuquerque, and for us to keep in mind that city property is purchased with taxpayer dollars. And so given that, we should try and be using it in a way that maximizes the efficient and beneficial use for the citizens of Albuquerque. This administrative instruction also tells us that if an employee has a need to take a piece of city property home with them, that they need to follow any important or any checkout procedures that your department has set up. So for example, for me to take this laptop with me today, I had to check it out and sign my name on a form for the legal department saying I was taking it with me. This rule explains that if there's any question or concern or conflict, or not necessarily a conflict, questions or concerns about what is personal use versus what is city professional use of property, that those questions or concerns need to be routed to the CAO or a department director. So I've talked about personnel rules and regulations, city ordinances, and administrative instructions. Where can I, as an employee, find all of these rules? Well, the first place to look, if you're looking for personnel rules and regulations, is on the city's eWeb. As for city ordinances and administrative instructions, those can also be found online, and you have the website there in front of you from AM Legal. Okay, Now I know where the rules can be found. What if I have questions? Who do I talk to? If I have any questions about any of the rules that I'm supposed to follow to be an ethical city employee and a city employee of integrity, I should go to my supervisor. And again, if my supervisor is unavailable, I should talk to maybe another supervisor in my department or my supervisor's supervisor. Another resource for employees, again, is the departmental personnel officer. Finally, another resource for city employees who have questions about these things would be the central HR department.